Thank you, Tatyana, for agreeing to come on this podcast to tell us all about your life story. And let me just ask you random questions.
Sure.
The purpose of my podcast is to just talk to interesting people or fascinating people about interesting things. So, and every time we talk, I'm like, you always have something interesting to say. So I'm like, I need to bring my friend Tatyana on. What makes Tatyana a little bit unique is she's originally from Ukraine. So she's Ukrainian. So tell me about, you actually were born and grew up for some of your life back in, I guess it was the Soviet Union at that point, right?
Yes.
The Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union back then. So tell me a little bit about your history then in Ukraine and you know, up until the point where your family decided to leave.
Let's put a time around that. So I was born in 1980, right? So yes, it was still Soviet Union until it fell apart, I guess, in 91 when the wall went down, right? So for 11 years, it was still under Soviet Union. After that, it became sort of a country of its own under Ukraine. And I mean, I think everybody's familiar with the history of Ukraine and exactly what's happening right now. It's still trying to fight for its independence, right?
Yeah.
But during Soviet Union, I mean, we didn't know any better. You lived in, you know, especially as a child, you lived in a closed country that had no Western or international media. I mean, there has been decades of the system that you lived in and, you know, all your textbooks and education and schooling. I mean, that was just your life, right? I mean, obviously it started to regress significantly as, you know, when it came to the end and right before the wall went down, there was, I mean, in my 11 years there, from what I recall and from what I remember, scarcity is probably the best word to describe it. is how it ended, right? Scarcity of everything.
Yeah. So you were there when the wall came down then, like you were in Ukraine up until that point. And was it at that point that your family decided to leave?
No, we left in 95. I mean, it wasn't as easy as just pick up and leave, right? Like it wasn't obviously allowed. There was a lot of restrictions.
How old? So you were like 15 then when you left?
That's right. I was 15. So I lived in Ukraine for 15 years. The wall went down. So the German wall, like, right, the Eastern wall that separated sort of the East from the West was in 91. And I mean, it was a ripple effect before it came down to Ukraine. I believe it was Lithuania or Poland. They were some of the first countries.
Yeah, I remember the Lithuania. Yeah.
That's right. So Ukraine wasn't one of the first, but it followed after. And yeah, I remember seeing on TV, I mean, tanks going to Moscow. I mean, everybody's like in shock, especially children, right? I mean, unfortunately, which is the reality of, once again, of history repeating itself and what you see there right now. Okay. Right.
And then so at 15, your family moved to Canada. And what part of Canada?
Ontario, so the province, and Toronto.
Okay. And I believe that, especially at the time, I don't know how it is now for Ukrainians, but at the time when you left Ukraine, in order to get Canadian citizenship, I'm assuming you had to renounce your...
Correct.
So you currently don't have Ukrainian citizenship.
I am no longer, I'm Ukrainian by blood and by history, but...
Do you still have family and acquaintances there that you're in contact with, or did most of them end up leaving about the time you did?
No, it's only our immediate family that immigrated, right? So me, my brother, and my mom and my dad. So just 4 of us. Everyone else stayed behind. And wow. I mean, they're still there. And interestingly enough, during the war or through this current war, Canada's, allowed for a refugee or a temporary 3-year refugee program for Ukrainians to be brought in. We brought a lot of them to Canada. Wow. And some of them have gone back as well. So wow. It's a clash of civilization. It's a huge difference between Eastern and Western Hemisphere. It's not easy. It's not for everybody. The assimilation period is difficult for sure, right? And especially if you're separated as a family, which much of these Ukrainian families are right now, because the men are not allowed to leave due to military mobilization.
That's right.
So the females or the mothers are leaving with the children. And imagine that you don't, for example, don't speak the language. You're worried about your husband back home. You in a different country, you're displaced. And after a while, especially if you are part of the country, aka Ukraine is not as impacted, I should say, you're saying, I'm going back home. This is really where family is. This is all I've known.
Right.
And we didn't want to come here. It's just because of the circumstances. They were fine living there. So a lot of our family has come back.
So interesting, because first, before we kind of get into the current state of what you just described, you brought up an interesting point of when you were at I will say probably one of the most critical ages.
Yes.
When you moved from Ukraine to Canada at 15, as a parent of kids, my daughter, when she went through the age of 15, most girls I know, 15 is a tender age where it can be, for any child, because you're on the verge of, you're a young adult, you're on the verge of adulthood. And it can be hard to leave your friends, your life, your family, your culture. And then, as you mentioned, you went from the Soviet Union to Ukraine's independence, and the version, like scarcity, as you mentioned, was people that I knew who at that time, back in the early 90s, that were visiting Russia or Ukraine or any of these countries, that's what they were saying. They're like, everything's scarce. It's a rough life. And then to go from that to the bustling, Western civilization of, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, that area. How was that as a teenager? What was that like? And I'm assuming at the time that you did not speak English when you first came, or had you been learning it on the side or at school or something?
The assimilation process was probably 2 to 3 years before you're like, okay, I don't want to go back. It's probably not the right choice of words. It's more of, oh my God, what is going on? Where am I? Right? To, okay, this could be my home. So it's 2 to 3 years, truly, right? At least that's how it was for me. And that involved a trip back to Ukraine in those 3 years of going, wait a minute, that is no longer what I remember or what I associate with. Right. And Canada at that time was still not something that I associate with. So people always ask, where's your home? My home is in the middle somewhere, because anytime I go back to Ukraine or have gone to Ukraine, it is no longer what it was during my childhood, or no longer what I associate with. So it's almost like, I call it, through your life, there's phases, right? So it was a phase that involved a lot of parameters, right? And that's what you remember. Then sort of, there was a phase in Canada, and this is the next phase is here. So it took a while to get the footing in Canada. And to answer your question, most Europeans speak more than one language. Like English is my third, fourth, depending on sort of the day, right? But I did have a certain capacity of the language, let's put it that way, at that level, right? The school that I went to was English immersion. We actually had, because the wall went down, a lot of American teachers or Western teachers have started to teach English at school. So the school that I was at was specifically English immersion, and I had sciences, English, geography taught to me by an American teacher from Connecticut. Not just me, I mean, the class that I was at. So I possessed a certain level of English, but it's nothing when you come here and they dunk you in it. Like the language that you learn, aside from that 1 year sort of experience with a teacher from Connecticut, the books are British English.
Oh, yeah.
It's much like, when you learn French, you learn Parisian French, right?
Right.
And then in Canada, it's like the Quebec French. So it's very different dialects. So I don't know if this is allowed on your podcast and you can cut it out, but I'm like, whenever I have like, a drink or two, and I'm like, it's my British English accent starts coming out because I'm like, your inhibitions come out, right? So then you're like, you resort to the basics, and the basics is like British English, right? A vase,
Right.
could you please pass me something, or a car boot. So
Well,
it's
you've got all the Englishes now. Well, maybe not all, but you have the British English. Then there is a Canadian English.
And now there's the American, and there's the South Floridian one.
Right.
Which
Which has got the influence of the South. Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we went in circles. Let me pause. Did I answer your question? So how was it?
You
Tender
did.
age,
Well,
how was it?
The one thing that I'm curious about is the cultural difference, because
Yes.
the word you used to describe that period of time before the period of time, after the wall fell until you left was scarcity. I would imagine that the social difference between, Ukraine, a former Soviet Union country, coming to Canada, which is, about as Western as you can get culturally, would be significantly different. I'm just curious how that was for you.
A shock. Really, it's a shock. It's a clash of civilizations, right? And it's where you come, where everybody takes public transportation, and it's, at that point is broken and, in shambles. Never been on the plane before, right? I've never owned a computer before. I mean, the TV for us was, it got a little bit better at the end there where, the Polish media started to come in. But up to this point, you get here and you're like, you have all these channels and everybody has a computer and there's internet. And what do you mean you can just walk into a grocery store and there's food everywhere? As a joke, what we did, and I don't remember the name of the brand, but ice cream. Like ice cream you get back home, aka Soviet Union, was in the winter when it's frozen. So the fridges worked, okay? And that's why it's funny, because I think all the Westerners always made fun. I'm like, how do you go to like Moscow or Ukraine and everything? And it's like minus 20 or so Celsius. I'm in Celsius still.
So cold,
right?
yeah.
And everybody's eating ice cream, right? Versus we got to Canada and we bought this, I don't remember, 2-3 liter tub of strawberry ice cream. And I'm just eating it with a spoon until I'm sick, because it was like, oh my God, I've never had this before. So those are silly examples, but these are like the daily examples, right? Like I remember when we landed, this was, oh my God, there were lights on the road. And oh my God, there were lines like on the road to show which way the traffic would go. Like, oh, there's no traffic. Everybody just drives wherever the heck they want at that time, right? Yeah. Like, so it was everything. It was from infrastructure to supply of, your daily commodities, right? And you're right, to the social, to what everybody's used to. So, of course, I'm the immigrant kid and I'm like, we don't have money. I'm like, where are we shopping? We're shopping in thrift stores and donations, and we're at the food banks, right? So I'm like, we go to the food banks. We're like, what is this food? Why is everything like in packaging and loaded with sugar? And I don't know if I should touch this subject, but
yeah, you go for it.
Food is different. Yeah. The way everybody dresses is different. Yes, I speak a little bit of the language, I'm repeating myself, but it's everything. It's everything.
It was just a completely different world.
Oh yeah, of course. You're literally like uprooted from one and you plant it in another, right?
The current Ukraine, you mentioned you had family, relatives who had, because of the war, come to Canada and then gone back home. When there's a war going on, you see the same news coverage I do. You see the same things being posted. They show the war. Ukraine isn't a big country, but you think about it, the US was at war for 20 years. We just didn't have the battlefront in our country. Recently in the Middle East, right? Mm-hmm. But even when a country's at war, there's still a battlefront and life goes on behind the lines, right?
That's exactly what's happening.
So when you say, I think, what would be interesting for the perspective for anybody watching this that heard you say, well, they came to Canada, they got out of the war-torn areas, and then went back home. They go, why would you want to go back where you're at risk of getting blown up by artillery or something like that? do you have any insight into, I mean, you made an obvious point, which is, the men are required to stay, and they're like, hey, I don't want to be separated from dad or my husband or my brother or whatever. But which makes sense. But beyond that, do you have any insight into what life is like for people that aren't right on the battlefront? And I know that's a relative term because rockets and missiles and stuff can fly a long ways, right? So
Ukraine is a big country, actually. So I'll say that, right? It is truly really separated into sort of unofficial areas, right? There's the East and there's the West, right?
Okay.
So we know that the war is in the East and a little bit in the South, in the Crimea.
Okay.
Everything else goes on. The infrastructure of a country has to go on. So people go to work, kids go to school, banks are open. From what I understand, and I'm not there, and instantly you say you watch the same news, I also watch the Ukrainian news, right? So I get it from there. So on Instagram and Facebook, whichever, right? So I actually follow the president, Zelensky, and you get the news from there as well. They go to restaurants, they go to coffee shops, their life goes on, especially in Western Ukraine. Do they have air sirens multiple times a day? It has become part of their reality now. Let me tell you this. My dad is currently in Ukraine visiting his sister.
Oh, okay. Wow.
And it's his second time that he's gone since the war started. Travel continues. They don't fly directly into the country. They go to Poland, they take the bus, they cross over. But all of that still continues. Life goes on. Humans are extremely resilient, right? And tenacious people. I mean, nothing stops. And it's in a way sad to say, because if it did stop, maybe this would stop the war. But I mean, life goes on. Life goes on. And that's what they're saying. And, when they were here, they would see it on social media. Well, hey, my friends are going to work. They're getting together for, play dates. They, with their kids. They're going to restaurants, they're going to comedy shows, they're going to see their parents, right? Yes, there's restrictions. Yes, there's, as I said, mobilization, you have cross checks, right, on the road. There might be curfew, but everything else, I mean, they're trying to live their life. We talked to my cousin today. It's his birthday tomorrow. He is an architect for one of the districts, and he has a private firm there. So his obviously business slowed down. Yesterday we talked to him. We're like, what are you doing? It's 7:00. Oh my God, the business is picked up. I can't go home. I can't finish all of these orders on time. So That's just a prime example.
Yeah.
He has orders for real estate, like home mock-up plans.
Wow. I think that's an interesting thing, an interesting perspective, because the majority of Ukrainians are still living their normal lives under some pretty extreme circumstances, functioning, relatively normal. And that's good to hear. I think that's a positive thing to hear about Ukraine as a country, about the citizens, about their adaptation, strength, whatever, to just say, you know what, we know we're at war. We know that we're going to hear the sirens going off multiple times a day, but we can't live in fear. We got to move on. We got jobs to do. We got kids to raise,
Ukrainians are generally, like, we have a lot of, I'll speak for that, for the background that I come with, definitely very proud of it, because it's made me sort of, I always say pragmatic resilience, and you've heard me say that as well, right? It is, I'm not an optimist. I'm not a pessimist. I'm a pragmatic, resilient type of person, right? It's what needs to be done with grit. Don't get hung up on the negative, right? Switch your paradigm into positive. But listen, are they impacted? Of course they're impacted, right? Everything's more expensive. Gas, like that was on the news, right? I mean, food supply, everything, electricity, like it's just people adapt. But I just want to take a pause and say this too, right? It's about the people, right? So in Russia, there are people that severely impacted by this as well. And that's the thing with Ukrainians, right? And look at them. They've adapted as well. Like, look how many sanctions have been put on them.
Yeah.
Look how many organizations have left, right? They're resilient. They're adapting as well. And I will say this, in the Eastern Bloc, especially in the Eastern Ukraine and Western Russia, there isn't a very strong division between, hey, I'm Ukrainian, hey, I'm Russian. Like there's such blended families. Like my last name is Russian, Medvedyeva. I'm from Western Ukraine. My father's family is both from Ukraine and from Russia. So it's, at what level is this war being played and who's truly suffering from it, right? And then the humans that are sort of living their daily life, they have no choice but to adapt, because ultimately they haven't chosen this at all, because by some sort of 6 degree of DNA separation, somehow they're all blended together, you know? And it's unfortunately happens across the world. Like, you know, when it was in Europe, when, you know, Serbians and Croatians or Yugoslavians were fighting with each other, right? What's happening somewhere else, you know, in North Korea, South Korea, like there's families that are separated. So I'm going in circles here in, conversation.
You actually went right into the next question I was going to ask, which is, you know, I have friends who are Russian, some who live in Russia currently. And, you know, I'm trying to think, do I know anybody else as Ukrainian as you? I don't think so.
Ukrainian as me, yes.
You know, I think I've met other Ukrainians, but most of my information about Ukraine has come through the media or conversations with people who claim to know people there. It's all third party, right? But it's interesting because I was watching a commentary today about propaganda. And the question was posed, you know, we often, as Americans, will say, oh, well, the Russian propaganda machine is telling all the Russians how great their cause is. And then the question was posed, well, every time there's a war, there's a two-way propaganda. And so I often think, you know, as someone who grew up, you know, in America during the Cold War, the thing that was amazing is I grew up fearing Russians, like they're evil, bad people. They all want to kill Americans. And then not long after, I started meeting Russians, you know, making friends with them. And then, of course, once social media came around, I'm like, we have so much in common. And then, you know, you hear about this between Ukraine and Russia and that close ties. It would be like the US and Canada going to war, you know, like there's like me, for example, half of my family still lives in Canada, you know.
That's right.
It's almost like a civil war
it's
some places.
Political ideology. It's not people movement or people desire to do this. Listen, are there extremists, fundamentalists in any country, in any culture, and believe this, the political cause? Yes. And that's what you see. Yes, there's two-way propaganda. Yes, it is true. Media is very limited in Russia now. Soviet Union had it down packed, and I mean, it's all over the news where that's where Putin grew up and kind of wants to live in, right? That's the blueprint that he knows, right? And like I said, when I lived in, Soviet Union, we didn't know any better. We were closed off. It's much like the North Korea. These people don't know, and the West is bad and it's going to invade us. Dave, when I was going to to school, must be elementary, in comparison, there were always the threat of bombs, right? So you guys here are having America lockdowns, like gun lockdowns, right? Yeah. We in the Soviet Union had gas threats. So we would have practice of going down to the basement in the concrete bunkers, sitting with the gas mask, right? As children, and I vividly remember all of us are sitting there. So it's both ways, to your point.
Who was the threat from at that point?
The Western,
Well, I can somewhat relate. I think, I was in elementary school in, let's see, the mid 70s to the early 80s. And I know that in the mid to late 70s, we were still doing, I lived near near Hill Air Force Base in Utah. And it was always seen as a target that the Soviet Union would try and hit us with a nuclear missile. So we would do I was about to say a fire drill, but it's not. It's a nuclear,
That's right.
drill.
Explosion. Yeah, I would call it a bomb drill.
Yeah, where we would have to, hide under our desks and, all this stuff. And they ended that in my school sometime in the late 70s, because by the time I was coming out of elementary school, we weren't doing that anymore. Mm-hmm. And I always assumed it was, at the time, it was because everybody realized how futile that was. Like, if they're going to nuke that place, hiding under my desk is going to do no good whatsoever. But as I've gotten older, I realized that there was a lot more, geopolitics going on, and right. I think as Americans, we started feeling more secure earlier than the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc countries did. What I remember is there was a fear that some of the, you mentioned extremists, that some of the extremists that weren't fans of, Gorbachev or Reagan or whoever was leading the world, back in those days, that they would come in, and do something bad and start launching missiles. And I'm like, nowadays, I think, how much of that was propaganda? How much of that was propaganda to get a certain response from the American public so that we spend our tax dollars in a certain way? Because that's the topic. As you see in America, the topic that usually comes up when it comes to Ukraine is how much money we send there. And the debate is, are we sending too much? Are we not sending enough? How much, supplies and things like that are we sending? And I heard a comment today that I'm just curious, because you're in the inner circle of the Ukrainians with your family, and you also have the very unique perspective of living, a majority of your adult life in Canada and the US. So I think you are in a unique position to offer a perspective that I think very few people have, because people who have lived their whole life in Ukraine have a
shock. Yeah.
So you mentioned something before. You said Ukraine is big.
Yes.
And the thing that's interesting when we're talking about the way that Ukraine is perceived in the news is that Ukrainians are united. The only difference would be like in the and I'm going to probably butcher the names, but like the Donbass regions or areas where there was a lot of,
yes,
the where the front lines are and stuff. But then it's sort of portrayed as all Ukrainians are united. And I have to step back and say, well, I'm pretty sure there's probably political divides there. I'm pretty sure there's different opinions on what should or shouldn't be done. And not just from the extremists. I'm talking about from the general population. Because anytime you have a large population, there's going to be diversity of thought. There's going to be, as we say in the US, there's going to be people with, more liberal ideas or conservative ideas. And the one thing that, that we experienced here in the US during, the terrorist attacks back, 9/11, as we say, is there was a unity because we were being attacked.
Correct.
And that unity lasted for a little while, and then we kind of got used to it, like this is our new reality, and then we just fell back into our own teams. So this war in Ukraine has been going on for a while. From your perspective, did you see something like that happen? Are the Ukrainians still pretty united because it's an active war, or was it kind of like when we did? We were like, oh, we're all united. We're one America. We're the most united we've ever been. And then 3 weeks later, we're like, yeah, liberals, or
it's
the same.
It's the same. Of course. I mean, it's different when you're being attacked, right? But then at the same time, where do people start putting the blame where you have no basic needs like water or light or heat, right? So, if we go with Russia, will we be provided that, right? Or, hey, we didn't have it anyways. Is it because Ukraine is not provided or not capable of providing, right? So, I mean, it's not much different. Of course, it's united because you're being attacked from that perspective, and we need to defend the identity and we need to defend the motherland, right? But it is united to those inner sort of social norms, much like any country, really.
So the follow-up question to that is, what I see on the news here, and I'm gonna put one more bit of context there, because I think in our modern times it's important to understand this context, because I don't think a lot of people do. I consume most of my news through online means, through the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that feeds me news looks at what I do, where my interests are. And I might be getting a certain, I know I'm getting a certain view of the world based on what the algorithms are seeing. And my neighbor across the street might be getting a totally different type of news feed.
Correct.
I try to trick the algorithms so that I can consistently see different things and be a little bit more informed. But based on that's the context I'm asking this question from. I get the sense that the U.S. media is saying that when I hear when they're talking about what's the solution to end the war, that they're saying Ukrainians want to fight to the death until the last man, and as long as they have U.S. support, they will continue to fight to the last man, so to speak. And I wonder, when Ukrainians are actually talking about how do we end this war with, in many cases, our family and our friends who are also on the other side, what is this? What is the sentiment, or is it varied?
So, as a reminder, I'm from Western Ukraine, right? Okay. Which has always been, or pro-Western, right?
Interesting. I didn't know that.
It has always been pro-Western. So context. So Ukraine is very big, like I said, and it's divided by a river, right? But most people in the East, even in the center in Kiev, speak Russian, right? The language. Okay. Soviet Union and everything. Very few Ukrainians, I'd say, from the East actually speak the Ukrainian language, right? The West has the language, right? Mm-hmm. And then, so it's just to say sort of there's cultural differences as well, right? It's much like if you go to California or if you go to Texas, they're different. Right. There's different beliefs, right? Or, you go to New York or you go to Florida, they're very different, but they're the same, right? Fundamentally. So to answer your question, what you hear in your algorithm of media news, right, is exactly what I hear Zelensky saying, like on the Ukrainian news as well, is the resolution to peace is getting every single square footage of land back and nothing less. And we will fight until we get that, right? Okay. That my family from the West, those that I know, everything that I see, that's the same sentiment, is that we want what belongs to us. It's like somebody came to your house and occupied a room and said, okay, well, good. We don't want any more war. We want peace. And you're going, well, get out of my house. Like, what are you doing? You've always said you're welcome. Hello. Like,
don't use violence. I want peace.
I want peace. Great. Out of the door. See you later. Right. So I don't know the sentiment of the Eastern Ukrainians that have been extremely impacted. Like there were cities that were demolished. They no longer exist. Right. There's atrocities. There's like, I don't know what their sentiment is. I don't know if their sentiment is like, oh my God, throw in the towel. Who cares? Like save yourself. I don't know. And my algorithm, my media algorithm does not give me those news, right? What I see is central political, so Zelensky and sort of his cabinet, and what I see from Western Ukraine.
I appreciate you sharing that because, I wouldn't say that I follow the politics of the war much more than, maybe a little bit more than the average person because I have this channel and I try and stay up to date on some news, maybe a little bit more than the average person, but I wouldn't say a lot. Mm-hmm. And so the way I always understood it is that ever since, 2013, 2014, when, Russia first, invaded Ukraine, the way I always understood it was that there were, as you described, areas that had a higher percentage of Russians.
Correct.
And not even just Russian-speaking Ukrainians, but actual Russians who were living in Ukraine, or they had heavy family ties. I always assumed that the amount of people who spoke Russian, who had those closer ties to Russia, was just very small areas. No. And now I'm gaining You're schooling me on Ukraine.
My job is not to school. And remember, I am not embedded there, right? So, I mean,
yeah.
Remember the sentiment that I said, where's my house? My house is somewhere in the ocean, right? I am not Ukrainian, Canadian. I'm not American. I'm somewhere in the middle, right? So I know from what I remember then, I know from traveling back and forth. I know from the news. I know what I hear from my family being there. Like I said, my dad is there, right? So, I mean, I'm fluent in Russian. My son, who's 5-year-old, who was born in Canada, is fluent in Russian, right? He speaks Ukrainian as well, right? So the language, Russian, Ukrainian, is very strong, and Russian is very, very strong language in Ukraine.
Okay.
Very large population speaks it. Never mind just speaks it. It's their primary language. In Ukraine, like I said, I'm from Western Ukraine, and it has predominantly been very pro-Western.
Okay.
Why? Is because who is a Ukrainian? Like, what makes up a Ukrainian identity is very different. In the Eastern, to your point, there's a lot of Russian because of the proximity, right? And Ukraine, sort of where it is geographically located, it is the gateway into Asia, right? AKA Russia, right? So Russia, the Ural Mountains becomes Asia. It has always been the route from Asia into Europe. We're that bridge. And this is why it's such an important political land, right? So through centuries, a lot of people and cultures have crossed that bridge, from the Tatars, right? So in Crimea, interestingly enough, it's not just Ukrainians and Russians. A lot of like Tatar or Ottoman descendants are there as well, right? Wow. In Western Ukraine, specifically, through century, the city that I'm from, for me, was from 12th century, right? So who is a person that lives in Lviv is Polish, Romanian, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Hungarian. Why? Because especially where I'm from, we used to be part of Austro-Hungarian Empire. We used to be under Poland occupation. We used to be under Lithuanian occupation. Like when I did my DNA test, which was a total shock, I'm like, 51% of my DNA is Lithuanian.
Wow.
I did not know that. Neither did my husband when we met. Sniffed it out is what I called it.
Or does that make your son 100% Lithuanian?
No, I don't know. Who knows? If I'm in the ocean, he's somewhere in the clouds. But that's the example of why there's such, like, what is a Ukrainian? And everything's different by history, much like in Canada. Well, who's Canadian? And you've mentioned that before in our conversation. Like, when I came to Canada, I came from a predominantly white, closed off society. Let's put it that way. I didn't see a computer or a person of color until I landed here. Let me just be clear. Okay. Yeah. So Canada, whenever somebody comes to visit, I always call it's the airport of the world, right?
Right.
Like, you got everybody there. And it's authentic. Yeah. It's truly authentic. Whereas in the United States, people always say, oh, it's a melting pot. Like, you really truly have to assimilate to the culture. And it's true. And it's probably for the right reason. I will say that, right? Yeah. For that unity, right? In Canada, now being here in America and having that perspective, right? Yeah. I have never seen that level of, I am an American. It doesn't matter if I'm Polish, Ukrainian, Mexican, Indian, whatever, background. I am an American, right? And I have never seen it anywhere else. I'll tell you that. I digress. Let me go back. In Canada, who's Canadian? What is a Canadian? That land belongs to the Aboriginal, right? We had the French that came there. So that's why Quebec is like a country within itself, right? So that's where there's such historical nuances that come in. And much like with America, okay, Texas, California. I don't know if I'm going to strike a chord with anybody here. That used to be Mexico. Yeah. Right? Arizona, Arizona, New Mexico, right? This used to be the land of someone else. Therefore, who lives there? Majority of the demographic are descendants of the land, of the people that inhabited that land. And that's Ukraine, right?
Yeah,
Majority of descendants of Western Ukrainians are from everywhere else.
As you were saying before, like say, well, this is my house. And then other people say, well, no, because my ancestors
This
lived
used to
there
be
first.
my house.
You're living on my grandpa's land that you took. So technically, and then you're like, well, no, actually you stole that from somebody else. And I'm like, so at some point, that's where war, and unfortunately, death and destruction is that paradigm shift. And, it's like, well, in your example of somebody showing up in your house and you say, no, this is my house. Well, if they assume your identity and make you not exist anymore, now it is their house, So it's a crazy, crazy thing. So
it puts things in perspective, right?
Into perspective. And it helps kind of understand in some ways the Russian point of view.
That's exactly what he's saying, actually, Dave.
Yep.
He's saying, why are you saying this to me? Because you have done this for years. It's part of imperialism, right? And you invading and colonizing all the other countries. How am I doing anything different? The only thing is in the modern world that is now looked down upon and forbidden.
Yeah.
So are we being hypocrites? Are we being hypocrites because we're saying, well, we did it and that's okay, but you can't do it now. Right?
Yeah, it is very interesting. And I it's really been nice to chat about that and get your perspective on it, because like I said, you have a unique perspective that from anyone I've talked to, and I hope anyone who's watching this can appreciate and be grateful that you came on and talked about, what can be, some sensitive areas to talk about, because politically, even with your Ukrainian history, Ukrainians have different political views, and you might say something that'll make somebody mad. And then in the US, we have the same thing. So I realize it can be kind of a delicate area. And so I appreciate you, sharing that insight that you have in the context that you presented it in, because I think context is always important when we're sharing our opinions. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you come on and talk about things, is because I know in our private conversations or in our conversations, not on the internet, you always consider context. And I think that's one of the reasons why it makes you such a fascinating person.
Oh, thank you.
But I do have one more question about Ukraine.
Sure. You're not ready to come off the topic, but okay. But I just want to
topic of the war for now.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
About that a lot, but I have a question about a historical event in Ukraine.
Sure.
Soviet Union, which is something as a younger person, it was such a crazy event. And I'm talking about Chernobyl. And then of course we had the Netflix made a movie about it. And then not long after that, all of a sudden Chernobyl's in the news again, because the Russian troops are coming into Chernobyl and why are we all getting sick? So you lived in Ukraine when Chernobyl happened. And I'm curious what you remember of that, how old you were, if you had any ill effects from that, or did it have any impact on your life other than being that happened where you were?
Can you see my scar?
Let's see. Where's your scar?
Right here. I had a really good surgeon in Canada.
Oh, yeah.
Out my thyroid.
Now that you pointed out, I have one too.
Do you?
Yeah. For a different reason. I'm not going to talk about
I was going to say.
Hey, we're twins.
I was going to say we're twins. It's funny. You never noticed in all of our meetings and conversations.
Yeah, I've never noticed either. So, okay.
I have no thyroid.
Okay.
Right? And it is because of Chernobyl. So let's put it that way.
Wow,
so,
okay.
And it's interesting because there's 3 countries in the world that are, which is what my surgeon educated me on, are always the people that they operate. Philippines, because of nuclear testing by the United States in their water.
Oh, okay.
Italy, I believe, because I'm going by memory here, because of because of a mountain explosion. You call it volcano eruptions?
Yeah, that volcano.
Oh God, whoever's watching this, I don't know, God help them.
explosion. That's a way better word than volcano. I'm going to just start calling
Mountain explosion. Sorry, folks, it's 10:40. I'm tired.
Way cooler.
Mountain explosions. And Ukraine, because of Chernobyl. So Chernobyl was a huge catastrophe, right? It's obviously, the nuclear explosion. It happened in 1986. I was 6 years old. Children are obviously the most susceptible, right? Children and animals. Yeah. So it was in the summer, from what I recall. We were actually vacationing. My grandma is from even more western North Ukraine. We were out there. So we would, as kids, would just get shipped out to grandma. We were all playing all day barefoot in the field, being happy, right? By the lake. My dad calls and he goes, get underground, get whatever you can do, whatever, dig a hole. Back then, everybody has cellars and cellars are underground, right? So we're all underground. What's going on, right? Of course, Soviet, we talked about media, right? And trying to minimize the impact and everything. So where I was, I'm going to do kilometers. I'm going to let you translate for our American friends here. Okay. It was about 550 kilometers away from where I was, where it happened. But because of the plume, as we all now know, right, and the wind blowing towards Europe, right, everybody was impacted. So I was a healthy child up to then, from what I'm being told by my parents. After that, I started to get sick on the regular basis, right? So colds, illnesses, just anything. It's just your immune system, right? My teeth started to, I wouldn't say fall out, but decay, you were having teeth issues and hair and everything that comes. So all the children were given iodine pills, mandatory by school. By the time
I hadn't heard of that. Is that supposed to help with radiation?
Oh yes, absolutely. Wow. Iodine is one of the treatments. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, I can show you a picture, but yeah, you would even almost like draw almost like a grid on the thyroid with iodine for it to absorb even into the skin. Wow. Amber, the gem, amber has a lot of kind of iodine in it as well. So a lot of the kids, me as well. I mean, all my children, all my childhood pictures from school, I'm wearing this almost like a choker of an iodine with amber. When I was 12 years old, the doctor was like, okay, I have modulars by this point. I'm a very hyper child. I mean, I'm high energy now, and I'm pretty sure it's a life of that, right? And you and I have talked about this. If I had to sort of relive something, I probably would have removed my thyroid when I was still a child, I think, and being on a stable dose of hormone replacement would probably have made me a different personality, let's put it that way, or energy level, right? But 12 years old, they were supposed to, okay, let's take out the thyroid. It's really not healthy, revving at high, let's put it that way, to RPM, the high RPM going on. So my parents said, no, we're going to immigrate at this point. We already knew we were going, right? The wall went down when I was 11, a year after my parents already set sail. We're getting the hell out of here, right? Yeah. So my mom's like, nope, coming to Western Hemisphere, change of water, change of food, change of air quality, everything. No, we're not just going to do it, right? Got here, Canada, or, the Western world. And it really, I think for years, or even twice a year, I would go for ultrasounds, for blood tests, just to check levels. And the endocrinologist has always told me, take it out, take it out, take it out. It will be cancerous later on, just take it out. Wasn't ready. I mean, you're a child, you're a teenager, you're scared. You're like, what do you mean? Your finger hurts. You're going to cut out the arm. No, you did say tender age. So, there's not much reasoning happening at that time either, right? From parents. It really didn't hit me until childbirth, when I was 38, right? Difficult childbirth. Christmas, no doctors available. They couldn't find an anesthesiologist. So gas mask, lots of sort of epidurals, lots of unnecessary drugs. Let's put it that way. It shut down the thyroid.
Wow.
Long story short, let me make it shorter for you, right? About a year down the road, or 6 months into it. Okay, something's wrong with your thyroid. We don't know how you're functioning. It completely shut down. Let's see if it's cancerous. So then we really split it up. And then I got in with an endocrinologist that specializes in surgery for thyroid cancer patients, because they didn't know if it was cancerous. The area was so large. I had something called toxic multinodular goiter, which means you have nodules that are hot in composition, meaning they're live, and there might be cancers. And the area was so big that a biopsy of 50 needles couldn't determine whether it was cancerous or not. So they said, take it out.
Wow.
So took it out. It was the best decision, I'm telling you. And I was how old? 39? Right? So it's been 4 years. My math is bad. 10, 45. But yeah, took it out. It was the best decision. I'm now on replacement hormones, calmer, immune's changed, body's changed, hair's changed, everything. And that's what I'm saying. Like, if you look back, what's the one thing, the Keller Williams, one thing, like, what will you do that will make everything better or unnecessary? It would have been having that surgery at 12. Yeah. Or maybe not having Chernobyl to begin with, to answer your question.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, what an interesting
journey.
And just it's kind of mind blowing that you're so attached to such probably one of the most, I'll say infamous, because it's a bad event in the world.
Yeah.
In all of history of the world. It's one of the most infamous, events where our advancement came back to sort of bite us in the butt, and you are forever impacted by that. It's quite interesting,
I'm probably one of the lucky ones as well, because if you want to have cancer, thyroid cancer is probably one of the best ones. It's external. That's one. But I live a lot. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of people that succumb to radiation at the time or later, right? It manifested itself in a variety of other illnesses. So I'm lucky, right?
Well, you just proved my next point I wanted to bring up, which is one of the things that I've always admired about you in the time that I've known you is you have this positive energy, even when, things, maybe not be going great. You have a lot of things going on. Maybe things aren't always going according to plan. You always give off a positive energy. I think some of that, to your credit, is just your personality and the way you've decided to live your life. But I also believe that the path that you've been on through life, the things that you've had to overcome, the challenges that you've been through, can drive you to go one way or the other. One is deeper into despair and deeper into, a disdain for life and society. And the other is to say, you know what, I'm going to go the other way. And I'm not even going to go down the road of saying one is better than the other, but I think because I don't want to assume that just because somebody has a negative outlook on life that they're not happy. Maybe they are. I don't know.
Maybe they just still haven't gone through that emotional tunnel, that they need to go through. Who knows, right?
But what I can't help, there's this, and I want to get your opinion on this. So I'm going to, I don't have a direct question. I have more of a sentiment I'd like to get your opinion on. It seems to me that people who tend to have a personality like yours, and one that I aspire to, only got there because of the trauma in their life. So as a parent, as somebody who's been around other people, you can try and teach things, but it's like, do we have to experience trauma, experience severe change, experience, those things to appreciate life? Or can we get there without the trauma? I don't know. How do we do that? Because obviously you've experienced a lot of what people would label trauma in your life. You've had a lot of significant, massive changes. just in your move and your culture and, everything that we've even talked about, which is probably just scratching the surface of Tatyana's whole life.
So here's the point that I want to make is we all are a product of our environment. Yes. And it's interesting that you say trauma. Even when you said it, I was like, I have never, ever.
I didn't quote it.
No. That's okay. You know me. And I'm like,
I'm just teasing you.
Yeah.
I don't feel like a lot of stuff I went through was trauma. I say people call it that. So
yeah, like that's just my life. That's my life. That's my journey, right? That's my life. I am a product of my environment and my experiences. Why? Because of my parents. We're all, and I firmly believe that, especially having now a 5-year-old child and not comparing in any ways, because that's not healthy for anybody. Sure. It's truly observing the differences in those environments. And therefore, the results that come out and the type of children, not the type of children, but the intellectual level, the physical level, the emotional, mental, grit. We are a product of our environment. So, and we've talked about this from a Ukrainian perspective. Ukrainians are generally we're tenacious. We got grit. We take on the one chin and everything. Maybe it is DNA. I don't know. My mom is like this. If you think I'm like, my mom is double me. Do you know what I mean? And I can only imagine what their trauma was, which is not a trauma. It's really just, it's their environment and their product of the environment. Yeah. It's their life, right? So I'm a product of my environment because of my parent. My parents have taught me how to channel anxiety, how to channel nervousness, how to regulate my negative emotions into positive outcomes, right? I'm doing that with my son, and I can see that, as a child, you get this, clay, and you're trying to mold them, not forcefully, but you're teaching by an example, right? Yeah. Hey, I don't want soup today. Okay, well, you don't want soup here. Here's another choice, potato. Okay, would you want potato or would you want soup? Okay, well, this one's better for you, and this is better. Okay, well, I'm going to have this. So you don't distract, but you channel it, right? And you expose, I'm a big believer, and that's what you see a lot with Europeans. We travel a lot. And I told you, English is my fourth language, right? When I graduated university, and this is something we didn't talk to, I wanted to be an interpreter for United Nations, right?
Oh, wow.
So at this time I possessed, Russian, Ukrainian, English, French, German fluently, right? Wow. So, and we travel, right? And I'm not saying Americans don't, many do. I mean, I just compared it to Europeans because of where I wanted my career path to take. But because my parents did that, they were professors or teachers back home, they traveled a lot as well, even within the country. That's what I saw. We moved every 6 years, right? Yeah, from different locations. Look at me. Canada, I'm now in the United States. I brought my child who's 4 years old, right? I mean, he's in swimming, he's in art, he's in whatever he gravitates towards, right? That's what we focus on, those strengths. So to kind of summarize what I'm saying to you, I don't think it's trauma. I think it's product of our environment, and it's truly the parents or the people that are caretakers to show the children on how to channel their whatever trauma, emotions, negativity into a positive outcome, not for anyone else's benefit, for theirs, for their own immune system, right? So that they grow up happy, healthy, stable individuals, right? Yeah. And how do you do that? By exposing them to as many different situations and environments. It's like shocking, shocking that, go swimming, go eat this, go try this, go try a hot pepper. Do you like it? No, why not? Right? Let's talk about this. So anyway, long-winded, like always.
No, it was great. It was a great, it's exactly what I was hoping. I mean, you would be able to talk to, because, you've thought about it. It's intentional. There's an intentionality in what you talked about in channeling. and I really am glad you brought that up, because as you were talking, I'm just going to share with anyone watching and with you, I mentioned my story, to myself. Well, my wife, my kids, they all suffer from depression. My daughter, severe depression. And I grew up in a time when we didn't talk about it. So, with my kids, that's why I feel comfortable talking about it here. We talk about it to everybody. It's like, because, I told her at an early age, I said, as soon as we recognized that she had severe depression, and I'm not going to get, there's certain words I can't say because I'm on YouTube, but trust me, severe depression. And she is a very happy, kind, generally, good-natured person. Most of her day, she's just this lovely person. And so the depression illness would come in and take over her nature. And she still struggles with it. She's a new mom. My granddaughter just turned 3 months. And, so she's still dealing with, the postpartum depression and things like that. And so, but I still believe, that that's why I said I don't want to judge anybody, because of the way they lived. I just want to understand perspectives. That's all. I just want to understand, not judge. And then, because you said it very well, the more you're exposed to, the more you understand, you can incorporate those things as tools. And so with my daughter, we said right out of the gate, we're not going to hide this. This isn't something you should be ashamed of. I said, your depression is exactly like me having Crohn's disease. I can't will it away. I can't just say, you know what? It's all in my head.
Part of your life.
Will it away. But the way I approach life can certainly affect my condition. And the way that the tools that I have in my tool bag. So I will say, even in the context of somebody who's suffering from a medical condition that affects their mood, like depression, I still believe that what you just described, and from a parent's point of view, and the way you expose your son, and then just the way you approach things, it can make a big difference. And so when you said, I think there's an element of it that can be taught. There's an element of intentionality in there. I wish that more people could grasp that concept, because I think it would be very beneficial for their lives to understand that even though you can't control, I'm going to use my disease, my chronic disease. I can't control whether or not I have it, but I can control what surrounds it. And that, in a way, has an impact on my overall health.
Correct.
So stress being one of them, the biggest triggers for almost any condition, including depression. And so when I observe how people like you behave in a stressful situation, I think, wow, I like the way you're doing that, because it seems like you can get out of those and overall it affects you. So I appreciate you sharing that. I know it's a kind of a personal question, and
I've referenced that before, and it's specifically kind of going back to your daughter and sort of what she's going through. There are two things. Yes, we're product of our environment. So we've just said nurture versus nature, right? So, okay. And plus exposure, right?
Yeah.
But we also have to be, and this is to your point, now being discussed, whereas before it was just such a taboo, right? There are a lot of people that have either been born with or have been impacted by external factors like me, right? They're not able to regulate whatever chemicality they have. And you heard me say, I wish I had the surgery decades ago. My life would have been different, right? Yeah. So, and this is for your daughter or for anybody who's dealing with any kind of sort of mental illness or any kind of illness that's striving from a disrupted system, a chemical imbalance, right? Getting that medically looked after is as important as that environment exposure, right? And that's what doctors, before you start exercising, you're like, have you been to your doctor? Are you fit to exercise? Is there anything else? Can your heart handle it? Can your lungs handle it? Can your joints handle it? Because if not, guess what? That comes secondary, right? So, and that's the same thing is this cannot be ignored. You can be and by this I mean, looking after it medically, right? And if you need to be on supplements, you need to be on supplements, and there's no shame or anything about it. But you cannot be mentally strong to be able to channel stress, to be able to channel negative emotions, anything into positive outcomes, if you're not physically feeling well.
Yeah.
Right.
Very good point.
Right. So it isn't like one and be all magic wand. Okay, parents, intentionally expose your children to environments and anything. Yes, that is important. Looking after their medical needs is just as important, right? So food, you and I have had numerous conversations about
we need to talk about food, because
when we feed our children, right? What supplements do they take?
Alive, and I think a lot of people, you're right. We've talked about this a lot, but we both know that that's exactly what I was thinking about when you were talking. I'm thinking a prime example of that is, I'm not feeling well, let me take some medicine. But which is one piece of many solutions. And then the other piece say, well, that medicine is making me feel better, but maybe I'm not. Anytime I go off it, whatever. And you say, well, is there something else you can do? What are you eating? Well, I eat cookies every day, 3 times a day. Maybe don't do that. See if that makes you feel better. And well, I stopped eating cookies 3 times a day, and you know what? I don't feel like I need the medicine anymore. So it's that sort of multifaceted approach. It's not just one problem, one solution. I think it's multifaceted aspect to both sides of that.
Exactly. It has to be an integrated, holistic solution. And it's not just something as good and bad as cookies or sugar or wine or whatever your vice is, but it could be, I cannot digest onions. I just can't. They make me feel very ill. There's some sort of enzyme or something in it, right? Yeah. What about people that have peanut allergies, shellfish allergies, anything, right? Like their whole system.
I can't eat all the superfoods. I can't eat spinach, kale, broccoli, any cruciferous foods. They will put me in the hospital.
You see what I'm saying? So and that's what I'm saying. I'm like, knowing as a parent, your child medical build, and I don't know if that's the right terminology, but do you know what I mean? I'm like, what works for them and what doesn't, and explore. And then this is where the environment comes in. Okay.
Yeah.
Try it, feed him, expose him to it. Right. And that's how you know. Right. So and circle back to exposure again.
but you're hitting on all the points. There's physical exposure as far as like literally where you live on planet Earth.
Correct.
There's physical exposure in, the foods and stuff that you're in. And then there's a whole variety of mental exposures that you can have as well. And, really that's when I've tried to think about why I want to bring people on my YouTube channel and do a podcast with interesting people with fascinating stories, is because I'm such a believer that having exposure or an understanding of perspectives and things like that can really be helpful, even if you haven't experienced those in your own life. I'm trying to expose people to things that maybe they don't have in their life because of where they live physically or who they know personally, or, I think about how much more I've learned from a particular Ukrainian's perspective in the context
Ukrainian, Canadian, American.
and it's such a cool perspective because it's unique. Just want to thank you again for coming on and talking to me and staying up a little late tonight to talk about this. And hopefully, we can talk for hours and hours and hours. So I'm probably gonna have
maybe we need to do like a talk show,
And especially anytime something major happens in Ukraine, who my go-to person is going to be.
I know, but it shouldn't be just Ukraine, because like I said, I've been out of there for a while. I'm like, I've shared with you my personal.
We can talk about diet. We can talk about whatever. And then when you start your own show and podcast, which I think you should, you need to come on here and promote it. So
sounds good. Well, I don't know. Thank you. It is just like one of our conversations like we have on a regular basis. So this felt really easy. Thank you for welcoming me, for making me feel welcome, driving the conversation. And what you're doing is great. And thank you for having me. And I hope it helps somebody somewhere out there.
Well, thank you so much.